In this video, I want to go over the top 5 problems that I found with this second generation F-250. This one happens to have the 6.4 liter Power Stroke diesel in it, so there will be some diesel related problems, just so you know. Let's get started. The first problem I want to talk about is the high pressure fuel pump causing a no start condition. Now what happens with this high pressure fuel pump that sits in here buried is the wires that go to it actually get rubbed up against other components, they get chafed, the signal gets interrupted, and it doesn't work properly anymore or doesn't work at all. And that basically causes the fuel not to get to the engine, and then obviously it won't start. Now, like I said before, the engine won't start when this is happening. So that's most likely how you'll notice that you're having this problem. So once you go through the diagnostic process to figure out why it doesn't start, if you end up finding that this is your issue, the only way you can fix this is to repair or replace that wiring harness. The second problem that I want to talk about is a loss of power. A significant loss of power actually, because this has to do with the boost pressure leading up to your engine. It's not the turbocharger's fault. Those can fail in other ways, but what happens, and the reason why I'm here, is because actually these couplers right by the intercooler or upstream up the pipe or downstream down the pipe can actually blow out or pop off or fail, and then the boost pressure just leaks out. The engine gets no more boost. It's just running naturally aspirated, and obviously it is not made for that. I loosened up these clamps so I can show you what it looks like inside here and show you some tips and tricks to help prevent this issue. So basically what happens is either these clamps fail or the pressure maybe gets too high, or just the boot or the sleeve can't hold anymore, the coupler. So what happens is basically this: it pops off, air escapes everywhere, you have no more pressure building up. Now with this removed, you'll notice that these clamps are easily replaceable. So if these are the issue, go ahead and replace them. You can also get upgraded or OEM replacement couplers, and these have little grooves on them, the pipes as well as the intercooler, but they're not very deep. So what you can do is re-groove it with something or take some really coarse sandpaper, scuff it up really good. You can do that to the intercooler too, but just be very careful because this right here is plastic, so don't ruin it, but scuff it up because that'll give this sleeve an area to bite on. And obviously, if you have oil leaking from your turbos, which is obviously a separate issue on its own, go ahead and degrease this surface, fix the oil leak, and then the coupler will have a nice tight area to grip onto. Now I showed you this one right here because it's the easiest to show you, but this can happen to any other couplers that are in this system. So double check them all and make sure that they're all good if you have the issue with one of them. Our third problem is going to be related to the radiator, but it's not really the radiator's fault. So what happens is the bypass for the thermostat actually is not functioning properly, and that causes spikes in pressure in the cooling system, and the radiator is the weakest point here. So that's what's going to take the majority of the damage when those spikes happen, and it causes it to fail and leak coolant. If you see coolant on the ground and you notice a coolant leak externally, double check everything: hoses, water pump, radiator, everything else that is coolant related, to make sure that you know where the issue is coming from. Now, if this happens to be your issue after you've diagnosed it and you notice the radiator is leaking, most likely the radiator will not fail by itself, especially at lower mileage. If you're not pushing the vehicle hard, it's going to be that thermostat bypass. So go ahead and replace that, get yourself a new part, and of course, replace the radiator, which by the way is this last one right here out of all of these coolers. There's a lot of them. But definitely replace the radiator, which you can buy at oneauto.com. And just as a side note, this is really heavy. For our fourth problem, we're dealing with coolant still. However, this time it's in the EGR valve, or the EGR cooler more specifically. So the exhaust gases, before they recirculate and get burnt up again in the engine, they get cooled down through the EGR cooler, which has coolant going through it. Now the seal between the coolant and the gases, so the piping for the EGR, sometimes goes bad and coolant will leak into the exhaust gas recirculation valve. That's what EGR stands for. And therefore, it makes its way into the engine, gets burnt up, and comes out the tailpipe as white smoke, which is going to be your indicator for this problem. Now, white smoke out the tailpipe, which, unless it's condensation, can also mean a blown head gasket, but that is not the case for this engine. The most common problem is going to be that EGR cooler, so check that before you blame anything else. Another thing you could do is periodically check your coolant overflow tank, which is this right here. Make sure the levels are up to par, and if it's losing coolant, if you're noticing that it's low frequently, then if you don't have an external leak, like we talked about earlier with the radiator, then it's probably going to be that EGR cooler eating up the coolant. So make sure you watch for white smoke out that tailpipe. It's going to be some thick white smoke, especially when you accelerate. Having said that, replace that EGR cooler as soon as you notice this, because you don't want this to continue happening. It is not good for really any components in here, and you definitely don't want to run low on coolant from this happening, because if you do that, you're going to overheat and destroy many other things. For our last and final problem, we're going to come over to the front end and we're going to talk about the death wobble. Now maybe you have, maybe you haven't heard of this. What this comes down to is worn out steering components, which I'll get to in a second. But just so you know, this will apply whether you have the two-wheel drive or the four-wheel drive version like we have here. So to preface this, I just want to say that this won't really happen when the vehicle is new. It happens as the vehicle gets up into the 80, 90, 100,000 mile range, because when it's new, the components are nice and tight. There's no play. As it gets older, play starts to form, and you might not notice it in the steering wheel, but there's going to be that little tiny bit of play in the ball joints, the steering components and everything. Maybe the alignment is even off a little bit. And that's when this will happen. So let's say you hit a bump on the driver's side going 65 miles an hour. That immediately will get transferred to the passenger side through the tie rods and the linkage here. The passenger side is going to respond by bouncing right back at it. So now these two wheels are fighting against each other, sending shock waves through this linkage. At the same time, the shocks will get sent through the drag link up to the steering damper, which is supposed to cushion the shocks and take up the vibrations, but it's worn out too. It can't do it. So at that point, the last thing that happens is it goes right into your steering wheel and it starts shaking violently, and you can't stop it until you slow down. So how do you overcome this problem and how do you fix it? Well, it's as simple as replacing all steering components. Now, you don't have to replace your steering shaft or steering wheel or the gearbox or even this adjusting sleeve here between the left and the right tie rods. However, you should replace all other components, especially the ones that have ball and socket joints. I would start with replacing your outer tie rods. They are connected to the wheels directly, and every single bump or crack in the road that you hit will go through these tie rods. On the passenger side, coming out of this adjusting sleeve, you have your lower tie rod end, and on top of it in the knuckle, you have your upper tie rod end, which connects to the steering box. So that makes a total of 3 outer tie rods. Obviously, replace all 3. Moving up from the passenger side upper tie rod, you can follow the drag link, and it might seem just like a large metal rod, but if you look closely, it has a ball and socket joint right on the end here, and obviously that can wear out. And coming off of your drag link is the steering damper right here, which is basically a shock absorber for your steering. So definitely replace this component, because over time it does get weak and it stops absorbing those shocks. They will get transferred directly to the steering box and right onto your steering wheel. And just as a reminder, you can buy all of these parts at oneauto.com. Now this about sums up the problems that I found with the second generation F-250. If you know of any problems that I didn't mention, or if you've had personal experience with any problems that I did mention, leave it in the comment section below, because I'm curious to see what you have to say. Having said that, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you can get all notifications for all of our future videos. So now, this wheel's going that way. Whoa. In this video, we're gonna go over the top. We're gonna go over the top. Yeah, we're already doing that. It's over the top. That's the one. Was it really that difficult? No.